Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Audrey, the director of the library, and we are so delighted to host Kristen and to see so many of you here tonight. I would like to thank Grow at Annenberg for sponsoring the Evenings with an Author series, and to thank all of you, our donors, our supporters, for sustaining the library's mission. So we are a lending library, you can see behind me. But beyond that, we're really a cultural anchor and a community of readers and thinkers like yourselves who are now connected from all over the world. Since the holidays are upon us, I wanted to mention a few library-inspired gifts. You can offer a gift library membership to friends and family, and you don't have to be located in Paris to take advantage of the library's resources. It makes a great stocking stuffer. We have nice gift certificates. You can also sponsor a shelf in our new expanded children's library, which will be open in the new year. And you'll get a little plaque with their name on it. So it could be for a child, for a grandparent, or just simply a book lover in your circle. And we also have traditional tote bags and mugs you might consider giving. You can also make a gift to the library on behalf of a friend. We're in the midst of our fall appeal. And as you've heard us say before, we are wholly community supported. So really every single dollar and euro helps. And it helps us to buy books and provide services and programs. So thank you for considering making a gift to the library. And now I'll turn it back over to Catherine O'Lean, our programs manager. Please enjoy this evening's talk.
Thank you, Audrey. Yes, welcome everybody to this Evenings with an Author program. Tonight, we're delighted to be hosting Kristen Richardson, who was born in London and now lives with her son in Brooklyn, New York. I just wanted to mention, so the book she'll be speaking about tonight is The Season, A Social History of the Debutante, and it was named a Smithsonian Best History Book of 2019. So we're very much looking forward to discovering the book, Kristen. Welcome and take it away.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Audrey, for having me. And hi, everyone. I see some friends or friends' names, so it's nice to see you guys. And I'm going to start by just mentioning that the debutante ritual is a much maligned ritual. You know, it gets people say that it's elitist and anti-feminist. Archaic, superficial, but I'm going to make an argument that although it may be many of those things, all of those things, that it also is culturally and economically significant. And I think for the first reason really is that daughters are and have always been the most reliable commodity for their fathers in times of economic and civil unrest, when fortunes fluctuated and social conditions were unstable. A father could almost always trade on his daughter to cement alliances and make his own family safer. And this was a formula that has essentially been in place for all of human history, I would say, with few exceptions. So what I do want to emphasize is that although that we often see the debutante as somewhat remote, the laws that were created in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century that affected women's property rights, upper class women's property rights, their rights to determine their own marriages, also affected working and middle class women. So you didn't make laws that only affected upper class women. So there was a great deal of trickle down effect. So if you wanted to control a woman's marriage, you could not exclude, you could not say only upper class women are not allowed to elope to Gretna Green without their parents' consent. So there were a lot of restrictions that trickled down. And then I also want to emphasize that the debutante ritual created a huge number of industries. And these are sort of traditional industry like or dressmaking, millinery, dancing masters, etiquette instructors, all of these industries developed and professions developed to service the upper classes in presenting their daughters. And then also publicists, social secretaries, stationers, florists. So all of these industries really got their start in serving the social season. And of course, that was where debutantes were presented and tried to create a marriage market for debutante presentations. And then it also provided a crucial role for people in society who otherwise would have been placeless. So that would be the chaperone, a respectable older cousin acting as a chaperone. It also created roles for gay men who were then committed bachelors, was one euphemism. And if they served as walkers, escorts to parties, arbiters of style, they were safer within a patriarchal system. So those are some of the reasons up front that I think we should take it seriously as a ritual. And I just want to get into how it developed and where it came from. And when I started researching this subject, I found tons and tons of information on what it is, what it looked like, where it happened, but nobody could tell me why. And there was no history explaining why this developed. And so that's what really interested me, because I was just determined to figure it out. And so my what I figured out, or what I found in my research, was that debutantes really evolved to address a problem. They were a solution to a problem that began with the marriage or the child, the family problems of Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII, as everyone knows, was, a very bad husband, and wanted, when it came to his wives, their inability to have a male heir, he decided, he would get divorced, and we have the Reformation and the break with Rome. But what they did in England that you hear less of, you hear about the dissolution of the monasteries. That's a big part of learning about English Renaissance history. But it was the dissolution of the convents that sent tons of young girls into circulation. So before the Reformation, the English fathers who were trying to find the best marriages that were economically advantageous to them, they would invest all of their inheritance money, their dowry money, into one daughter. And they would pick the best daughter, their idea of the best daughter. So the most attractive, the most charming, what have you. And then they would put all the other daughters for a small fee into convents. And so suddenly you have this English aristocracy left with a huge surfeit of daughters that they didn't know what to do with. And this was a real problem, because in order to get your daughters married, you had to provide a dowry, and you didn't want to lower the family fortunes by putting the spreading the wealth around too thinly and not attracting the right kind of suitors. So all of a sudden, a huge daughter problem. And a lot of you, I'm sure, since you're at this talk, probably read a lot of Jane Austen. And this is the key plot line in Pride and Prejudice, and where Mr. Bennet is like, what am I going to do with all these daughters? And this was the daughter problem. And so you had immediately this emergency where people didn't know what to do, and it was really destabilizing. So they started to try to figure out ways to marry their daughters off. And now Queen Elizabeth, after her father died, was left with a really unstable social situation, and she decided that she would bring, you know, there were still a lot of Catholics around, so she had a really politically unstable situation. So she brought the daughters of her favorite courtiers to London, or not London, to Hampton Court, and had them presented to her, and then she would marry off her favorite courtiers' daughters in ways that were advantageous to her. And then these girls would act as intermediaries between her and the wider court. So this was really her presentations. This was the first recognizable sort of debutante formula: a presentation at court, an arranged marriage, and then a connection within society. So this kind of continued and expanded. The aristocracy moved more towards cities after the initial blast of. Can you excuse me one moment? There's someone drilling outside, and I can't hear you all. I'm so sorry. I'll be right back.
No problem, Kristen. This is what happens when there's a pandemic and you're housebound and you have housework going on. So just bear with us a moment. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Am I back?
You're back, no problem.
Okay. Yeah, I'm so sorry, I'm having house renovations, and I told the guys to please not drill in this amount of time, but they got the time wrong. Now they know, so it shouldn't be interrupted again. I'm very sorry. So I think I was talking about the transition from Queen Elizabeth's court. So just sort of the formula that she created was very successful, and it began to sort of be, people began to adopt it, not just in the royal court, but outside of it. So you had these marriage markets kind of pop up, and particularly in London, there was, the aristocrats started to create these events. They were called assemblies, and they would find an assembly room, which was just a place people could gather and listen to music. It had a big hallway, a big ballroom, and all of these different sort of places you could eat and drink. And they started selling weekly subscriptions and controlling the guest list, really, really locking it down. And so these became enormously popular. There was one called Almack's, which, you know, you may have heard of if you read Regency literature. It was sort of, you know, they called it the seventh heaven of the social world. And it was run by a group of really authoritarian patronesses, including a lot of political hostesses. And so the connection between introducing daughters, which would happen weekly at this party, and politics became really cemented. It followed the rhythms of Parliament, and it was held at a time when every politician could attend. And so it was just an area of real power brokerage, and everyone was watching these girls be presented. So it was a very theatrical and staged, and the girls would study to, you know, do the dances properly and hold their bearing, because the marriage market with so many girls in circulation had become really, really competitive. And so the Almack's model was so successful in getting girls married that it really spread everywhere. And you had these big and little assemblies all over England, all over the colonies too. And so you had more important ones at Bath, and then really kind of little country assemblies, but it was the same formula of people gathering together weekly, which was important. And a saying at the time was, it takes many dances to make a marriage. So this gave young people a chance to prove themselves, or to get over a disaster if they had experienced a disaster, which we all do, like people drilling during your talk, for example. So the assembly model is really, you still see it in the debutante experience now. You go in, you're presented, you wear a fancy dress, you're announced, and that's really the origin of it. And that model continued for many, many years. It was exported to the colonies in the mid 1700s, so very, very early. And the reason for that was really more in the US. It was more about aspiration and maintaining a gilded thread to London, where people, rich people were largely loyalist, and they really wanted to maintain this connection to England, which was sort of where the ultimate social authority was located. And they wanted to have connection to England. They wanted to wear the same clothes as people wore in England, and learn the dances that were danced at really at a distant foreign court. And so you have assemblies popping up in all of the Atlantic seaboard cities: New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, Savannah, all by the mid 1750s. After the revolution, you would think, we're liberated, we're no longer attached to the Mother England, but it became even more important, because when you had lost that thread, people were dead set on maintaining their social status, particularly in a new Republican, little r, Republican environment. And so it maintained its real importance, and it was crucial in cementing wealth. In the 1680s in the US, people were already inheriting, rich people were already inheriting most of their money. And by 1700, 10% of the population controlled 50% of the wealth. By 1750, that number was up to 60%. I don't even know what it is now. I think it's really horrifying difference now. But hereditary wealth and keeping it in families was the critical for families to maintain their power. So I guess we're up to the mid 1800s. So in the Antebellum South, in the Antebellum North, the ritual was different. In the Antebellum South, it's everyone has the image of Scarlett O'Hara, where you have this lone debutante, this sort of Jezebel figure. But the reality for women in the South in the antebellum period, debutantes, was they were very isolated and alone. So they had not really, their social interactions were so limited, except during their debutante season, which was often held in a city. And just to give you an idea of how isolated and remote it really was, George Washington and Martha Washington used to post an enslaved man at the end of their property by where someone might drive by, and anyone who drove by, they would invite that person to dinner. Like, it did not matter who it was, because company was so few and far between. And if you go back and you read these debutante diaries from that period, there's so many references to I do nothing, I'm constantly at home, I am, my life is worthless. So they're really intense. And then when you get to their debutante period, you see this sort of explosion of joy and letters, and they would prolong it for as long as they could. And a lot of times that was also because they didn't want to get married, because their life would then go back to being what it was, this sort of drudgery, now of course power over enslaved people, but also just real boredom, not seeing their friends. So the Southern debutante, the picture of the Southern debutante is not really as coquettish or vixen-like as what we typically get. It's quite different. And the girls, they would delay marriage for as long as they can. So they tried to keep going season after season. And they have letters, the letters to each other are really funny. They keep, one of their locations of resistance was to make fun of their suitors. And so there is, there's this various letters, one talking about a guy who's so nervous that he was sort of eating his tie, and another one they called the frisky widower because he would call on girls who were too young. And so there's a lot of, sort of liveliness and in their debutante experiences that you would not necessarily get or assume was there. But in the antebellum North, the debutante was very restricted. And this was a sort of world of interconnected families. I'm just going to use New York as an example, since it's usually a good example. But this was a period where it was very traditional, society was impenetrable, and it was really quiet, staid, inflexible, and restricted. So no one could get in unless you're from a like New York merchant family or a real estate family. So after the Civil War, that sort of fractured some of that calm and created a situation where a lot of people who had made money in the war, maybe they had made money in armaments, they had made money in things like blankets or potted meat even. They had this massive wealth from those sort of provinces, let's say. And they were coming to New York in droves, and they had masses and masses of money. And they were very socially ambitious, and they tried desperately to enter society. There's a really well-known story of these three sisters, the Jerome Sisters, who were from somewhere in the rural US, I can't remember, but he had made a ton of money and they moved to New York, and there are these three beautiful sisters, and they can't get into any parties. So their father was accepted by the men, the guys in New York finance, because he was so successful. But the girls were being blockaded. And this was a very typical situation in Mrs. Astor's New York, where it's traditional, it's conservative, and she's a gatekeeper, and other women were excluded, and people with new money. And there were a lot of, as I said, there were a lot of girls in the situation. So the mother of this set of sisters, these are the Jerome sisters, decided, okay, I don't want it. This is a pain. Sorry, I couldn't think of a polite way to say it, but she's like, I'm done. And then we're gonna go to Paris. And she went to have the girls presented in Paris, which was actually easier to do in that period if you just had money than it was in New York. And so they went and were presented in Paris to Napoleon III and Eugenie, I guess she was American, or not Eugenie, Pauline maybe, I can't remember, but they were all presented. And then having been presented to an emperor, they couldn't be refused in New York. So that was the way you sort of worked around it. And then they went to London, where they were socializing with the Prince of Wales and having all these really sort of wonderful affairs. And one of the daughters, Jenny, went through her debut, came out, was rumored to have an affair with Edward VII, but she ended up marrying Randolph Churchill and bringing a huge fortune over to Blenheim, where you always repairing all of these big English houses, country houses. So very difficult marriage. It was haggled over. There were bets about whether it would come through or not. The fathers met at clubs trying to figure out the dowry. The Americans were horrified that Jenny would not have her own money. They wanted her to have her own money. But finally they were married, and about 7.5, 8 months later, they had their son, Winston Churchill. So we have a lot of very sort of connections between significant figures, American and English, and Winston Churchill certainly embodies that. So that model that you'd all know from Downton Abbey, the wealthy American woman coming to England and Europe to a lesser extent to buy her title, is the classic formulation that you see in history and literature all the time. And I think it's really compelling because it's very dramatic and interesting, and also was often really sad. And by the end of the 19th century, a lot of these marriages were collapsing in divorce, and the sort of tragedies of these marriages were becoming better understood and known. And people started to get sick of this sort of debutantes going to England, and the British were sick of it because they were like, these girls are taking all our men. But in the US, people were sick of it because the transfer of wealth was really significant. And between 1870 and 1914, about $220 million left the US to go with these debutante daughters to their new husbands. And that's around $4 billion US now. So these girls were a significant resource of financial resource for European aristocrats. But by the early 1900s, these marriages were sort of, as I said, they were collapsing, and people were sort of souring on the idea of this kind of traditional debutante method of creating alliances. But by the sort of late 1800s or early 1900s, society was sort of collapsing anyway, and World War I really ultimately sort of fractured the debutante experience. You know, you have women at war and mechanization. Women at war, I mean men at war, women in jobs, and when the war ended, people started to try to begin the ritual again. And there are descriptions of women describing a series of women from age 16 to 24 kind of coming out at once in 1918 in London. And the debutantes looking weather beaten from driving cabs and ambulances during the war. And so there was a lot, and there were so many men died that there were no suitors. And then additionally, it was very hard to serve on the front with someone and then have them come back and act as a servant to you. So the social divide really, it lessened at that time. And then just to run through, so yeah, so I guess World War I ended, and then you have this sort of roaring 20s. The debutantes in that period were liberated in the way that you would expect after a war. And I think, and also a pandemic, with the flu pandemic. So the roaring 20s debutante was really interesting, the sort of flapper debutante. One of the reasons she was much more liberated was that you couldn't go into a speakeasy and bust anyone without also busting yourself. So what women were doing in these places really furthered the liberation. And there were a lot of debutantes in that period who just began to refuse to do it or to rebel in some kind of gentle way. I mean, they weren't fully liberated, but there was a debutante who had a column in the New Yorker writing about how debutantes are just, out of style, and she was forced to do it. And there's sort of these little flip essays in the Talk of the Town, which are pretty cute. But by the end of the decade, though, you have the Depression, the Great Depression. And interestingly, that was one of the heydays for the debutante ritual. And that was when debutantes became real celebrities. And I think the dual frisson of looking at these women and thinking, oh my God, this is just immoral and disgusting, and having this sort of moral reaction to this massive display of debutante wealth, hugely expensive debutante presentations, and just a really off-putting, grotesque displays of wealth during the Depression. At the same time, rich people, beautiful people, glamour. So there was this kind of, I think they were compelling because they satisfied both the desire to escape and the desire to criticize. And if you can do that at once, you usually really, you've found yourself a compelling ritual. So, but in the 1930s, you had debutantes like Brenda Fraser and Gloria Vanderbilt, Barbara Hutton, and they all had these sort of poor little rich girl kind of stories that were really tragic, and people were very interested in them just because they've seen them in the paper since they were little girls, and just they had these tragic stories of massive wealth and parents fighting over inheritances and things like that. So when they became debutantes, they were already known. And now these girls, they endorsed cars, they endorsed skin creams, they were full-on celebrities. Brenda Fraser was on the cover of Life magazine. And this was the first period of sort of cafe society and being famous for no reason. This was the forerunner of, Paris Hilton or the Kardashians, this sort of celebutante, which was a term Walter Winchell, the gossip columnist, coined at the time. Now, around this period, though, the debutante ritual had lost its utility. If it developed to get women married, it was no longer doing that. Women had options; they could work, and because it had outlived its original utility. People were really doing it for only status reasons if they were doing it. And now World War II further fractured the tether to the debutante ritual. No one was doing it in those years, obviously. But the 50s, it became really popular again. And it became popular in this sort of country club conformism kind of way. So conformity, everything looks good, girls in white dresses, purity, all of these things that were really important after the war for people to try to feel a little better about, feel a little more stability after the war. And as you might imagine, by the time, and in that period, you find a debutante ball in every town and city. And it's still kind of like that, although less important. But then it was absolutely one or several debutante presentations sponsored by local country clubs or local civic organizations. And then the 60s, unsurprisingly, 60s and 70s were, I would say, the real nadir of late 60s and 70s, the real nadir for a debutante ritual. And this is a period where the women that I know who did it in that period would trying to, do it in secret, really, just, and you could potentially be forced to, or cajoled or bribed to do it by a mother or grandmother, which still happens, of course. But it just was incompatible with the civil rights and voting rights, racial justice, feminism. People were having a very difficult time in finding ways to do it, unless they just had sort of convinced themselves that it was just a party, it was a fun party. And it remained more popular. It becomes more regional as well, that in the South, where with sort of different social standards, and that it remained more popular there, is more politically conservative there. And then it was pretty dead in the 70s. And I talked to a couple of ball organizers who just said they did not think they would make it through the 70s. But with Reagan's inauguration, you had just an explosion of conservative, resurgent conservatism, rituals that were ostentatious displays of wealth, really, really intense interest in showing wealth, showing power. And that was when it became popular again, and then it ebbed again in the 90s, and it came back really in a major way in the 2000s, and has remained very popular, which is something that I could talk about in the questions, because I want to briefly mention, and if you guys have questions about this too, I can get more into it. I don't want to go over the time, but I want to briefly mention the African American debutante ritual, because for me, that was one of the most interesting parts of researching that book. It really began in earnest after the Civil War, but it also, like Black Americans had balls through parties, elegant parties, from colonization, from the late 1600s onward. So white people, white historians, the old discourse tends to lump all Black Americans together into this sort of homogenous mass of degraded people, not seeing nuance. But the African American Deb tradition is really a prime example of how much richer the African American history is. And so there were always balls, but during Reconstruction, creating a debutante ritual was part of a wider effort, and if you've studied African American history, part of the uplift movement, where Black intellectuals were determined, because white people there was no way that white people would voluntarily accept African Americans and give them equal part of culture. They decided that they would make a concerted effort to lift themselves out of this sort of place that they had been forced to be in. And so they started holding deb balls. Civic organizations, sororities, held deb balls throughout, and still do, during Reconstruction and onward. So if anyone wants to ask more questions about that, I'd be happy to answer them. And then I'd be happy to talk about it also, what's going on right now and in China and Russia, if you want to ask questions about that. But I want to leave time, because questions are my favorite part. So that's that, I think.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Kristen. We'll give you a silent round of applause. Thank you for your presentation and your talk. I was just also going to drop the buy link in here in case anybody is interested in purchasing the book online. Here we go. So please do send your questions in the chat, and we'll get through as many as we can with the time remaining. So I guess we'll dive right in with one I had pretty early on. So this one reads, it seems in the West, daughters were valued more, while in the East, sons were valued more. So thinking of the one-child policy. Is this a reasonable view?
Well, I will out myself as someone who cannot speak with any authority on Eastern history, but I do think the daughter was more financially valuable. So valued in a pure monetary sense, yeah, it was very easy to monetize a daughter. A son, it wouldn't be, the son would just inherit money, whereas the daughter she would inherit money, but then the father could very easily direct where that money would go, to what person, and whatnot. So I think it is, I don't want to generalize overly much, but certainly the daughter had a great deal of financial value.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very global question. So thank you for doing your best to jump in and answer it. So the next one is a little bit more specific. It's about paying the dowry. So this person is asking, how did they solve the problem of paying the dowry? Were the subscriptions to attend, I assume this means to the balls, used to cover the cost of that?
No, so the subscription cost covered the cost of putting on the event. So the liquor, the musical entertainment, things like that. So it didn't really run a profit. The organizations were sort of break even, and they put all the money into hosting the event. The dowry was what the money that a woman would arrive at her marriage with, that her father and his family would be able to use. So that was organized between families and paid upfront.
Okay, great, thank you. So we'll move to a different question now, which is a little bit more personal. So we have someone who would love to know how you had the idea for the book. Was it something in your own background?
So yes, it is something in my own background on one side of my family. So I am from, on my father's side, a waspy kind of old money situation where there are a lot of debutantes. But on my mother's side of the family, it's a working class Irish Catholic. So I'm very much two very different halves. And because of that, I was always really interested in social class and how that played out in people's lives. Because if you have two different families with really different, you know, and I'm sure a lot of you or some of you had experienced that, where you have really different backgrounds in each family, you're just always going to be really aware of those differences. And when I was 17, no, I don't know, it was like 17, 18, the debutante, someone asked me if I wanted to do it. And I thought, oh my God, this is crazy. No, I don't want to. But it was also, you know, it was the 90s, and there's just no way. I was super shy, and it was a time period where, you know, I was wearing flannel and listening to Nirvana, and I just, it was so out of anything that I would ever have thought to do. But I've always been interested in it, and I was also really interested in how sort of derided it is, and for me, that always means there are interesting questions there.
Yeah, thank you for giving us a little bit of insight into yourself as a teenager. I wonder if you would have imagined you'd have written this book, you know, at this moment.
No, definitely not.
Okay, great. Oh, this one is just a follow up on that. So looking back now, do you wish that you had done it?
No, I don't. I went to a lot of them. So I think I got kind of the best of both worlds. I went to a lot of deb balls in my time, and they were really fun. You know, it was, you know, we're 19. I remember just drinking a lot, you know, in ways that you shouldn't, and wearing the dress, and, you know, making fun of your friend who had to curtsy in front of people like right after lacrosse practice, like that kind. It just was a really awkward and fun time. And I would not have wanted to be the one curtsying. So I feel like I got kind of the best of both worlds.
Okay, great. So you were touching on race already a little bit towards the end of your talk, and I have a follow-up question about that, which is this still a mostly white and privileged affair?
Oh, absolutely. I would say by and large, it's a white and privileged affair. There is a really vibrant African-American deb scene, but within the larger context of who is debuting, it's overwhelmingly white. And it's pretty easy to also say it's in service of white patriarchy as well. You know, it's an elitist ritual, it's very exclusive, and costs a lot, and is a really powerful display of wealth and privilege. So yep, still white, still privileged.
Right, thank you. So I'll ask this next one with the caveat that you've already, you know, you've said that you're not a global expert, but we do have someone curious to see what's happening with the ritual in China and Russia. Do you have any insight into that?
Right, so this is actually, in the book, I argue that this ritual is unkillable, that like every generation, people are like, oh, you know, people are gonna stop doing that. But it's never gonna die, I'm convinced. because there is always someone, it's so malleable, you can kind of make it into whatever you want. So China and Russia, both of which are experiencing their own gilded age with robber barons and oligarchs and toxic waste and like smoking coal and railroads. It's just an intense parallel. Are both countries are now hosting deb balls, and in Russia, there's one in St. Petersburg that is absolutely insane. It's sanctioned by the Russian state. The Bolshoi perform. It's the Philharmonic perform. So the equivalent in the US is unimaginable, or in the UK, it's like Yo-Yo Ma playing a deb ball. It's like, it's just ridiculous. But Putin's press secretary's daughters came out, various oligarchs, smelting coal, all of these things. And it's just a way to prop up, telegraph some elegance, and also to keep your daughters and wives kind of compliant, right? Like, so if that's a really key part of it. In China, same story. China is a little different, really kind of interestingly, because of the Cultural Revolution. A lot of people don't have any information on any ancestors that they've ever had. So there's a huge interest in, a massive interest in history. And of course, England is really seductive for anyone who's interested in history. And a lot of sort of new rich people in China are doing things like buying whole libraries at auction, or like buying a house and like shipping it to China, like with, and putting it back together piece by piece. The debutante is part and parcel of that. And also for both of these countries, the debutante ritual, having a daughter come out as a debutante, does this really interesting thing that I would call reputation laundering. So and my best example of this is Ren Zhengfei, who is the leader of Huawei. His daughter came out in Paris, actually, in a couple of years ago, at the height of when he was being investigated for under the Espionage Act. And he is notoriously publicity shy. He stays away from everything. His daughter has a different last name. She goes to Harvard, she's a ballerina. There's no contact. And he went with her and he did press. And this was a way for him to displace a lot of what was happening at the time with but look at my beautiful and elegant daughter at this prestigious ball in Paris. So there is quite a bit of reputation laundering that happens. And this happens in the US as well. A lot of people use it to further their family status and get press. That's really, Instagram publicity is very much what it's about now. So that was a long answer.
No, it's fascinating. Thank you so much for elaborating. So I have a two-part question. I'll ask it in two parts here, of course. So the first is there a link between dollar princesses and debutantes?
Yeah, I mean, the dollar princesses were these girls who basically were like Consuelo Vanderbilt and Jenny Jerome, Megolé, like these famous American industrial fortunes that went over and kind of went over to Europe and married these aristocrats. So yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. And then the second one is there a link with religion in the debutante balls? And then this person has just reminded us that in France, the rallies are mostly a Catholic tradition.
Right. So not I stuck with the Anglophone world primarily because I was interested in it as a secular marriage ritual. I mean, it was related to religion in as much as it began with the Reformation. So it's kind of essentially Protestant in that way, but there's no religious component in a debutante ritual typically. I do think there are ethnic groups that present debutantes. Like I know that in New York there's a Polish history society that does a debutante thing, and there are others too. But in terms of la calle or quinceañera or all of these sort of coming of age in a religious sense, there is a relationship because it's a coming of age ritual and a sort of statement, but it's not religious in the same way as those other events are.
Okay, great, thank you. And then we have a question about the Whit Stillman movie Metropolitan, about the Manhattan debutante season. So is this something you've seen, or what did you think of that?
Yes, I love it. I think it's a fantastic film. I also think it's the best depiction, one of the best depictions of social class, actually, of like a WASP upper class, the most authentic that I can think of in American cinema. I mean, he obviously is from that world. He knows it really well. That's what the balls that I went to were like. Really quite a bit like that. So, and it's a great movie. Yeah. So very, very, very good.
Great. Yeah, maybe people can jot that down if they're interested in learning more then afterwards.
Definitely, that's a good one.
Okay, great. Okay, so we have one more here, which is, what's the benefit for the young woman debutante today? If it's not to find a marriage and it's more for families to show wealth and status, what does the young woman gain from it? Great question.
So that was something I didn't talk a lot about the reporting I did in the book, which is in the final chapters where, you know, I go to these balls and talk to women and whatnot. But that is a question that I asked quite a lot because, and nobody really likes to answer that question. They kind of run from you when you want to get in there because it's kind of, I think the answer is kind of yucky, really, because there's a lot of, when you ask the girls, they often say that it's about networking. And there is this kind of smooth business speak added to they add that. And press and publicity, for a lot of times they're trying to promote a personal brand, which is actually something that they would say when I interviewed them. And they're so young. And I was like, oh, you know, this is kind of gruesome, but it is that people really, girls that age some of them just want to have fun. Some of them, one girl very refreshingly told me that she wanted to feel like a princess, which I feel like was kind of sweet in a way. It was very pure, you know. It was like, yeah, I also felt like that at certain times in my life, younger for sure, but I think that's something a lot of women go through. But I think that status is really a huge part of it, feeling like you belong to something. So I think, but what they gain in a practical sense, it is connections. And there's a lot of, like, they talk a lot about networking. There are, you know, some of them would say things like girl boss for real. So I personally believe it's a status thing, but then the explanations are ways to kind of try to work around that, to try to not kind of say, I get status from it. But yeah.
Right. Fantastic. Thank you. So we have one final question here, which is, have the debutante balls changed in the presentation of the young men and women over the decades?
Yeah, they've changed. Well, one of the things that's kind of great about the debut, or I mean, I think it's kind of great, is it doesn't change much. And I think that's sort of necessary to ritual, because if you change it all the time, then you kind of rob it of its ritual. That's what ritual is. It's repeating, right? It's a repetition that shows that you're part of something and that you're going through something that other people have also gone through. So while they've evolved a little bit, I think the fact that they're archaic is actually crucial to their success. So yeah, I think they may change a tiny bit, but it's not much. I mean, they're pretty recognizable. So yeah.
Okay, great. Well, that's it as far as questions, and we're coming right up to time, so this is perfect. Thank you so much, Kristen, for this lovely presentation. And if you in the audience are interested in buying the book, I did go ahead and drop that link. You'll just have to scroll up a little bit and then make sure to click it before we close out here, otherwise you'll lose it. So thank you, Kristen. This has been such a nice time with you.
Thank you all so much. It's nice to be in Paris again. if tragically virtually.
We hope to
But
see
thank
you again soon in the city.
Thank
So
you.
I'll just, I'll close out by saying just a few words again about the library. So as Audrey had mentioned in the beginning, we are a nonprofit institution and we do welcome donations. If you might be interested in giving a donation after tonight's program, I did include a link in the email that went out with the Zoom link as well. So you'll find it just above that. And we generally, you know, suggest about 10 euros for programs in person. So feel free to support the library if you choose to do so. We'll be very happy with any and all donations. Thank you again to Grow at Annenberg, our sponsors. And finally, I wanted to just offer one quick preview of an upcoming event in January. So I've posted almost all of our events through January and February. You can find those online on our programs calendar. So go ahead, I invite you to take a look and see if you might be interested in signing up for some of those. So just one highlight here. I'm very excited about this one. So we're going to be hosting Dejan Sujic, who's the author of The Language of Cities. And that'll be on January 5th, so our very first event of the new year. He'll be speaking to us not only about this book, but also sort of what is the future of the city, given the context of the pandemic and sort of the, you know, the world after, le monde après, that we've been wondering about for so many months now. So I think it should be a great event. And thank you again to Kristen for being with us tonight and to our audience for your participation and engagement.
Thank you.
Take care. Goodbye.